Greetings, I'm Dack Rouleau, and this is Overwritten. In tonight's episode, we will have the first of several discussions of The Lonely Crowd, a book written by David Riesman and published in the year 1950. Before we begin, though, I would like to address the Overwritten audience. My readers, listeners, and even my viewers, few though they are, deserve an explanation for my recent reticence, as well as an understanding of what I intend for Overwritten henceforth to be. Hitherto, Overwritten has been dedicated mostly to news commentary, especially political news commentary. In recent years, however, I have come to question the validity and integrity of this practice. The independent media is overrun with political news commentators, all of whom are expected to issue hot takes and instantaneous reactions to anything and everything that emerges in the broader political media. My analysis, based on years of observation and direct participation, is that this kind of commentary is little more than ideological reactionaryism, and much of it, if not all of it, is disproven in time, often in very little time, as additional facts and information surface. If we wish to understand the modern world, then ideological reactionaryism obviously will not do. And ideological reactionaryism appears to me to be an inevitable feature of political news commentary. It makes no difference whether the commentators are independent or not, for their reactions are still formed in myopia and ignorance. Jimmy Dore and Caitlin Johnstone seem to be the biggest names in the independent political media, but if we review what they said months ago and compare it to what they say today, then it immediately becomes obvious how little they knew then and how little they understand even now. They apply their personal biases to their consumption of the news with predictably unenlightening results. A better approach, and certainly part of the correct approach, is not to immerse ourselves in the chaotic noise of the present, but to look backwards to read the words of thoughtful men and women who lived and observed and studied long ago. The purpose of this practice is to understand the present as part of a historical continuum, not as the isolated byproduct of the past century alone. How can we understand the alienation of post-industrial humanity without reading Dostoevsky? How can we understand the decline of tradition without reading Plato? How can we understand our collective lack of values without reading Nietzsche? Obviously we cannot, and no reactionary ideologue will serve as an effective substitute. Accordingly, I would like Overwritten to move away from political news commentary and to move towards literary analysis. The best videos on the Overwritten channel were obviously those I produced with Christy when we read and discussed the writing of Machiavelli. That was the Overwritten book club where we read The Prince. We found The Prince to be not just compelling, but also deeply relevant to the modern world. We found that we could understand quite a bit of the modern world by reading The Prince, even though it was published hundreds of years ago. And my goal is for Overwritten to become known for that type of content. The ideological reactionaryism that was for so long its staple, I really want to move away from that completely. So with all of that being said, I would like to discuss the book that I am reading now, The Lonely Crowd, a non-fiction work of sociological analysis written by David Riesman, co-written by Nathan Glazer and Riul Denny, not entirely sure how to pronounce his name, and originally published in the year 1950. It is interesting and revealing that a modern audience would consider The Lonely Crowd to be an old book, even though it was published less than 75 years ago. There is a strong anti-historical tendency among modern Americans, including those who were born around the time The Lonely Crowd was published. There's a real desire among them not to read history, to avoid anything that might be considered antiquated or dated. But that tendency is really a discussion for a different day. Today, I would like to discuss David Riesman's observations of his own time and compare his analysis to what we might find in the world today. As I mentioned, The Lonely Crowd was published in the year 1950, when America was just beginning to emerge from the Second World War and just beginning to establish itself as a global economic superpower. Under these conditions, the baby boomers were coming into being, although I'm not sure the term baby boomer had even been coined by the time this book was published. In the year 1950, the oldest of the baby boomers were still under the age of 5, and so they could not have been understood as an autonomous, isolated category of individuals with distinctive developed personal characteristics. They were simply too young for that kind of classification. But how foreign this is to the modern world, where we have a very defined and specific image of the boomers, and frequently speak of their imminent demise. We speak of how the boomers are about to begin dying out en masse. And I mention all of this because Mr. Reisman writes at some length about changes in parenting and child rearing in the United States. Changes that were still recent in his time, but which had become widespread, more or less, by the year 1950. He describes the newfound sensitivity and receptivity of American parents to their children's wants and desires, and to the parents' own desires to fulfill those wants. He observes a shift from previous systems of parenting, whereby children were molded and shaped according to external expectations, either their parents' expectations or society's expectations. He observes a shift from that style of parenting to a more modern philosophy, one in which the children seem to determine standards and values. Now, obviously, this approach to parenting is not uncontroversial. Putting children in the driver's seat, so to speak, is obviously going to engender controversy. And in Reisman's time, as well as our own, this approach to parenting has suffered criticism, much of it quite convincing, for producing pampered and entitled children who go on to become dysfunctional and incompetent adults. However, in our time, this is still believed to be a recent phenomenon. We believe that this practice of indulging children did not begin, or at least did not become widespread, until the 1980s or the 1990s. It is said to be the millennial condition. For millennials, we are told, were the first to be coddled and spoiled en masse by their permissive, short-sighted parents. Now, without considering whether millennials are, in fact, pampered and indulged and coddled and sheltered, we know that this alleged phenomenon is certainly not recent. When Mr. Reisman refers to the youth of his time, he is referring to people born in the 1930s, possibly even the 1920s. He is referring to people who were coming to the end of their adolescence by the time The Lonely Crowd was published in the year 1950. So these are the people who would come to raise the baby boomers. The baby boomers were their children. And these individuals would raise these children, the baby boomers, under a certain set of standards and values. And so what it appears to me is that in all likelihood, this generation, when they raised the baby boomers, they were extending their own tradition of indulgence to the boomers. Now, I hope that that wasn't too wordy for everybody. So basically, this idea that the boomers were raised with this rugged sense of deprivation, and it was only with the millennials that we started coddling our children, that is just demonstrably false, as this book would indicate. But as illuminating as his study was and is, I am sure Mr. Reisman would have been the first to admit that he sometimes painted with a rather broad brush. He never intended to suggest that every member of the greatest generation and the silent generation, these are the generations that raised the baby boomers, he never meant to say that every one of those everybody who was part of those generations was pampered and indulged. He isn't trying to say that. He isn't trying to make a blanket statement. But he does prove that this phenomenon was expanding, however gradually, throughout the first half of the 20th century. It may not have become widespread until the year 1950, or possibly sometime thereafter, but in any event, Mr. Reisman knew the conditions for such a phenomenon were being cultivated in the meantime. Undoubtedly, these conditions met a perfect storm of sorts in the 1950s, when affluence flourished in America, and when unbridled consumerism became a standard and a norm. Now, I suspect that this information will come as a great surprise to a great many people. At the very least, it informs our understanding of the culture war currently being waged between the boomers and the millennials. The boomers describe the millennials as spoiled brats who have deviated from the respectable respectable American tradition of rugged discipline. And while there may be some legitimacy to this accusation, it is clear enough from reading The Lonely Crowd that the Millennials have not committed a radical break from their forefathers. They may be spoiled brats, but if so, then they are fourth or fifth generation spoiled brats, with the boomers being the first or second generation of spoiled brats. Now, personally, I don't think that this dimension of the culture war is particularly productive. There is very little sense in blaming people for the way they were raised, and without a personal experience of the historical conditions in question, we might not fairly blame the parents for raising their children in this way. There is, however, reason to suspect the boomers' criticism of the millennials is to some extent a matter of psychological projection. The boomers' criticism of the millennials may be a romantic revision of their own personal history. Furthermore, we might ask whether the romantic revision of American history, the historical narrative that the boomers accepted and promoted, we might ask whether this itself is influenced by some of the same psychological tendencies of projection and evasion and revision. But at the same time, we must not reduce this insight we have gained by reading The Lonely Crowd to a convenient reason to rail against the boomers. That would be a wretched repurposing of Reisman's work, if not its effective negation. Instead, we must approach the problem of indulgent parenting anew. We must contextualize it as part of a multi-generational phenomenon. This phenomenon did not begin with the millennials, but maybe it is nearing its culmination with them. Maybe the consequences of this philosophy of parenting are finally manifesting themselves clearly, and will become increasingly clear with each generation that adheres thereunto. We will continue our discussion of The Lonely Crowd in the near future, but today we will end not with a quotation by David Reisman, but with an aphorism written by none other than Nietzsche. And Nietzsche said, quote, "When we find we must change our opinion of a man, we hold the inconvenience he causes us very much against him."